Welcome to one of the most overpowered tanks on World of Tanks PC, but this is not, of course, World of Tanks PC, and so with the introduction of this tank as part of the new and latest season for World of Tanks console, we're going to take a look at this vehicle, what you can expect from it, and of course if you purchased it, kind of give you a bit of backlog as to what this tank is all about. It is as part of the Ultimate Season Pass, which you can get right here in the store for 6,000 gold. So essentially you're paying 4,000 gold for the tank and a commander, and then the additional 25 levels already completed of the Season Pass itself. So that is where you get the BZ from. But of course later on down the line, if you're watching this long into the future, the BZ will probably be available for something like 10,000 gold or somewhere there or thereabouts. So make of that what you will when it comes to the cost comparison as to whether or not this tank is even worth purchasing. So anyway, jumping into the tank itself, the BZ-176 does indeed have 650 alpha damage. It's the main component of what makes this thing pretty darn good. But of course, on PC, this tank has 800 damage, but it also features a much higher penetration value than on the console version. This thing only has 80 millimeters of HE pen with this tank compared to the 200 and plus that it gets with the HE on PC. And of course on console we do not have the reformed HE mechanics that PC also have, where they act more like a shell and can go through things like tracks, etc. So HE is definitely in a much worse state on console compared to the PC version, making the fact that not only does it have less penetration, but that actual damage is going to get absorbed quite easily by a lot of the tracks or anything that gets in the way of your shell hitting. And talking about things hitting, you are going to have a bit of an issue with the speed of the rounds, whether you fire the standard or the premium rounds, being those HE, which aren't actually premium rounds, but you get my drift. They have 860 meters a second, which is pretty lackluster on the AP, and then 760, which is even worse on those HE rounds, making this thing a bit of a brawler in terms of the engagement ranges that you're going to want to be in. However, because of the fact that this does play up against tier 10s, having only 208 millimeters of penetration from its AP rounds limits this tank massively. And this is often the case when it comes to wargaming, and the differences between PC and console is that often the console version typically gets a severely nerfed version of whatever is considered overpowered on the PC, but oftentimes that goes way too far to the point where they remove one of the key aspects that makes the tank good and essentially revert that so that the one aspect that made it really good is bad, and therefore now you're stuck with a tank that really the other factor that was about the tank, being those AP rounds, is pretty bad. And so 208 millimeters of penetration, for example, if you're coming up against a BZ of the same tier, you are going to really struggle actually going through this tank because of course, armor angling. Yes, it has 100 millimeters of effective armor, which is in the lower plate, is where you're going to want to probably be hitting this thing if you're playing in a BZ. Yeah, trying to hit that and aiming down into it is going to only accentuate your problem, and you're probably going to bounce off that lower plate anyway. So it's a bit of an issue with regards to penning one another. And then of course, as you start moving up the turret of this thing, you're not basically going to be able to pen another BZ unless you do manage to hit the top of the roof of this thing. Remember that console's overmatch mechanic is also not really a thing, at least from what my experience of playing the game. It has been a question that has been dodged by Wargaming, or they have never given me an answer to my question as to whether or not overmatch really works as intended. And certainly from my experience, it is not the same as PC, so overmatching the roof of the BZ doesn't seem to really work on at least the console version of the game, and it has 41mm on that roof, which means that you're going to have 123mm or higher, which is perfectly fine for the BZ, which has a 116mm main armament, where those AP rounds would be very useful to overmatch a lot of tanks that you'll be coming up against. However, that doesn't seem to really be the case on console. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe you guys have a completely different opinion on the overmatch mechanic in the game, but from my understanding it doesn't really seem to work like it does on PC if you've ever played PC. Anyway, regarding the HE rounds, obviously 18mm is not god awful, but it is not good. You are not going to be able to pen very many things with these HE rounds unless they're side on, basically. So even the mediums from the front can be an issue, especially if you're facing the Soviet vehicles. Those ones do have some decent chunky frontal armor that are going to bounce these HE, and you're not going to deal full amount of damage. However, you'll still chunk away, you know, 300 hit points of their hit point pool when you do hit them with the HE, and you don't have to aim. Yeah, in terms of which round would I fire, this is a very interesting topic because I, to be honest with you, still don't really know. I've had games where I've only fired AP, I've had games where I've fired only HE, and typically the games where I only fire HE typically do more damage in those games. However, this does need to be made aware that you should not just be using one singular round for the battles. You should be checking your ammunition based on the tank that you're going to be fighting, and that is a key thing for playing this game and playing it very well. So the rounds where we actually swap between both are kind of the best rounds that we had. But generally, if you only wanted to use one ammunition, I'd probably say the HE, because you can deal damage to everyone. And the AP, if you've got it loaded and you aren't taking the equipment because there's no intuition on console, you would then have to use advanced reload, which might actually be worth doing, and dropping out the traction system for that increased speed to run the advanced reload, so you can just swap freely between the ammunition of your choosing. And I think that is probably what I'll be doing when I'm running this tank again, just because it's a little bit nicer to be able to have that flexibility of what you're actually firing against opponents. So definitely the kind of loadout that I would be going with. The tank has pretty lackluster DPM for a heavy tank, even though it does have high alpha, and because of the fact that you can bounce quite a lot with those AP rounds, because most heavy tanks at this tier have armor that is going to be able to bounce that 208mm, and of course if you're fighting higher tier vehicles, that is only going to be an accentuated problem where you're just going to bounce off a lot of things with the AP rounds, hence why the HE rounds can also be useful against those, you know, the higher tiered armored vehicles, heavy tanks, tank destroyers with decent armor. And in fact, it almost works counterintuitively, where you think, well, I need the penetration to go through the thickly armored things, when in fact actually the only times I really fire AP is at those mediums that have a little bit of armor, so the Soviet mediums really, whereby you can still pen them with the 208, but the HE you're not going to be able to pen. And then of course you can load the HE for the heavily armored things that you're just never going to pen with 208, where you deal 0 damage. And then of course when you can find yourself a light tank or a very weakly armored medium, something like a CDC or anything of that ilk, you're going to be able to pen with 80 pen and deal that 800 damage, which is certainly not that rare. There are plenty of opportunities for you to pen with 80 pen and 800 damage, but they are far fewer than on PC, which is a good thing. This tank was outrageously broken and in fact had the best armor of any tier 8 heavy pretty much in the entire game on PC, and then had one of the best main armaments with nearly it had 800 alpha damage with more penetration on its HE, which is just blatantly overpowered as anything. And of course then you get the speed boost mechanic, one of the interesting aspects of this tank that you don't typically get with any other, because of the fact that you can activate it and you can go up to like 50 kilometers an hour for a short period of time during that rocket, and then it has a short period of cooldown, and then you can use it again and continuously go. This is very, very useful for those early game engagements against other medium tanks, which you can pen, the light tanks, the mediums, because you'll be faster than pretty much every single heavy in the game, and you'll be faster than a lot of the mediums at the same tier as well when you are activating that rocket boost. So you can essentially get to the same position a medium can, or a light tank nearly, and be able to deal damage to them, because they are weakly armored vehicles that are going to be able to have that top speed generally, and therefore you're more likely to get a HE pen at the beginning of the game than towards that time of the game where the heavies start to have actually moved up to the position that you're going to. So HE, very, very useful. Now, one thing that is something to be said for this, we've touched on the armor we've shown off the armor model, which is very, very strong, and it is same on console. It's very, very strong. The armor of this thing does work. It doesn't work necessarily against tier 10s, but as with any other tank at tier 8 as a heavy tank, pretty much no tier 8 heavy tank, even including the super heavy tanks, just does not work against tier 10s anyway, so comparing that, not really going to be a thing. However, compared to the other tier 8s heavy tanks, this thing has very, very good armor, and of course it does get yourself a decent amount of gun depression as well, which is also nice, because when you combine that together, you're going to end up with a tank that is going to get held down very, very nicely with its 10 degrees of gun depression right there. So very nice on a hill, can be a real dominant force and just absolutely obliterate people. However, it does get significantly worse accuracy than a lot of other tanks in the game. You can see even with all of the boosts and a crew, on console, it still only has 0.36 accuracy, which if we were to compare to, say, for example, a different vehicle, let's get rid of this filter and go for, I don't know, the Bog Horror, right? Not the best comparison, but this thing does indeed have a commander in it. It's got 0.33. So it's still fairly accurate, but it isn't the best, and certainly you are going to derp a few shells, which definitely adds to that pain of when you don't pen. And then you've got a chunky 18-second reload pretty much with the equipment and the commander that we've got in here, which is not the greatest by any means at all. So those are the sorts of things that you need to be wary of. The tank actually has pretty good view range for a heavy tank. You can see we've got 452 meters of view range, which is more than enough to spot a lot of tanks when you are cresting ridge lines and stuff like that, just using your turret, for example. And that gives it a different advantage to some of the other heavy tanks of the tier. When you then compare that with its still concealment, it's absolute garbage. So the still concealment sucks. You're going to get spotted almost every single time. But what you are going to be able to do is at least spot the opponent back and get yourself some assistance damage in there as well, which is very, very nice with this tank in particular. And then in terms of standard top speed, 30 kilometers an hour, it's pretty slow. It's fairly slow to turn as well, which is also an issue when people do get around you. You can be outflanked quite easily in this tank when you are on your own. But of course, when you use the speed boost mechanics, you can get away from people. Typically, I'll only use 1 or 2 speed kind of boosts at the beginning of a game, and then that gives me 2 boosts to be able to try and use towards the mid or late stage of the game. Maybe you go on a flank, you dominate it, and then you can move on to the next area of the map that you want to get to, so you can kind of dart through areas of map which otherwise you would be a sitting duck in. This tank is going to take a lot less time to cross those areas with that speed boost mechanic compared to a lot of other heavies. So that is kind of what we gone for. Of course, premium consumables, all of them. You don't really need fuel or anything like that. Pretty much your bog standard enhanced repair kit, enhanced med kit, enhanced rations. You don't need the enhanced repair kit or enhanced med kit, but always take your enhanced rations. That should be a must in all of your tanks that you do play. But you can drop out to the standard repair and standard med kit, and then yeah, that's kind of what you want to do. And then the most important one to get as a premium out of the 2 med kit and repair is the repair kit. You're going to use it a hell of a lot more than the med kit. if you want to save yourself a little bit of money there. But that is pretty much the BZ. Overall, pretty a decent vehicle. However, let's jump into some gameplay of the tank, see what this thing does in the actual game, and kind of show you some examples of what we talked about. So, jumping on over to Berlin for the first game of today's video. We've got 2 games that I'm going to showcase off today. Berlin is, of course, predominantly a small town map in the game, and so the opportunity to use the boost is minorly useful. I mean, it's not the best for this sort of map, and pretty much all of the town maps, things like Himmelsdorf, Ensk, those sort of maps, you're not really going to find those boosts all too useful, and certainly not when you decide not to actually play the game for the first bit. So yeah, of course, what we're doing in this game, it is a predominantly tier 6, 7 and 8 game, with the majority of players being tier 6 and 7. So starting off, we are going to make our way over towards the F0 area. I am obviously not paying attention at this time, probably on my phone. But we're going to make our way towards the Trinity right there. We go for a shot on the move, not expecting to hit it, but if we do, perfect. And so now we can make our way around the Trinity and make our way to try and side scrape. Now the BZ can side scrape, especially in these kind of tier 8 games, maybe not tier 10. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend side scraping in tier 9s, but 8s it is possible, and that's kind of what we're doing here. You can see this is our 208mm of penetration, able to go through those heavily armored mediums that we're talking about, the T-34-3 Black Edition right there, which is the Chinese medium. So unfortunately taking a pot shot at one of our friends over there, but we're up to what, 658 damage. Now that is a chunk, but remember, there are a lot of vehicles that can do 700, 750 damage, and when you consider things like the ISU-152, those sorts of tanks, that is kind of what we're dealing with here. You can see we're angling against this Churchill right there, just trying to make sure that we don't take any constant damage from that guy. We're using the buildings in between to get a few pot shots on these guys, and there you go, that's the second enemy taken out. We've got 2 Batchat 12Ts behind, which do pose an issue, but there's quite a few teammates that are going to come in and support us. So the Batchat's kind of going away. We've still got the 2 tanks in front, so I need to at least take a stance as to try and take out someone. A T-28 prototype auto aims us on the move, and we're going to put one directly into the side of the T-28. He's got the smaller gun, so he is a fairly stock T-28, which allows us to really start kicking out the damage. Hopefully we can get one into him before he manages to get behind. He does put one into our lower plate there, which is absolutely fine. A pretty decent trade considering we took him out from full health in 2 shots. That's what the BZ does. It's a double chunker, especially in these tier 8 games. You really do have the ability to remove people quite easily. And then, of course, unfortunately, we meet ourselves the low health T-34-3 there, which we do manage to get one shot into. And that's fine. That's the 4th enemy picked up of the game. And we've got ourselves a Churchill who is on a decent chunk of hit points. And we're going to try and make our way over there. Hopefully the Churchill doesn't take too much damage in the process. He's on 400, and of course he does, and that puts us in a bit of a predicament here. We are now going to come around for the Tiger 2, but he's taken out quite easily as well. But it does put us up to 5 enemies taken out with just under 3.1 thousand total damage. A okay game in the BZ, and certainly a decent game, enough to showcase what this thing can do in those sorts of matchups that are more favorable. Of course, there's a lot of tier 7s, tier 6s in this game, which is why our armor held up a lot better than in those tier 10, tier 9 games that you can meet. So jumping over to the next replay then, this one is probably one of my least favorite maps, mainly because it's not that different every time that you play it, but we are going to make our way over to this hill area over here, rather than duking it out on the heavy tank corner, which could be a bit of an issue in a tier 10 game. That's where the BZ's faults really come in these tier 10 games, where you do have those heavily armored vehicles that can be a bit of a pain to try and deal with. We got ourselves a little Panzerjäger over here, who we were hoping we could get a shot onto, but it seems like he's just doing rings over there. We're going to try and get hold down here using this little ridge in front of us to hide the upper and lower plate, because in tier 10 the upper plate does really suck. People are going to go straight through it. If they've got like 250 mil of pen, pretty much yeah, it's not looking good for you in that department. And sometimes if they've got super high penetration heat rounds, then they can go through the turret of this thing, but of course that's talking Jaeger sort of heat rounds, and some of the high tier tank destroyers with, you know, 300 plus pen on their premium rounds can go through the front of the turret, but that's, you know, debatable, and sometimes it will still even bounce those, but in terms of the gameplay style in this sort of game, this is where you're kind of stuck, because with such a long reload of, yeah, nearly 18 seconds, you can push in and try and do damage, but it's also one of those weird things where even if you do push in and try and do damage, if you've got no team support or you're lacking in the team numbers to really help you out, if you do get into a bit of a pickle, then you're going to be in a pickle. And so you've got to play somewhat passively but also aggressively at the same time. Weird, kind of, I know, obviously doesn't really make sense from a logical standpoint, but at this point I'm thinking I'm not doing enough here. We really need to get involved in the action, and this is where those boosts come in handy. You can see, especially when crossing water, they still work, they don't cut out or anything. And we're going to push into the middle ridge over here. I'm just wondering if anyone's actually over there, that maybe we can get some spotting damage when we're playing in this tank, see if we can get a decent chunk of damage as well. And there's quite a few lightly armored tanks that we can fire at when we're kind of pushing through. Now this was the first game in the BZ. I was really testing out whether or not the tank's HE rounds are good. We were kind of testing out a couple things, one of them being like, can we hit through the tracks, for example? Can we do that sort of thing? How much damage are we dealing when we do meet some of the actual tanks that we're going to face? Obviously, when you're meeting up against lightly armoured vehicles, you want to go for the lightly armoured areas of them. And with this tank in particular, obviously 80 pen. And of course with this tank in particular, 80 pen, more than enough for things like gorillas and to pen Tyrans and that sort of stuff, if you do find the side of their tanks. But it isn't the greatest, and so we're kind of in this situation where I'm trying to spot for the team, see if we can proxy spot people. We're spotting the gorilla there, see if we can get one into him. We got a Spatuk in front of us, which we can definitely pen. The Tyrant comes up, but it's right as we just start turning for a different direction, which is, you know, typical World of Tanks right there. And then we come around here, the Spatuk gets one into us, but it was more of a auto aim, or just wasn't paying attention enough to get the full side of our tank. He then comes out side on, and we put one into him for 816 damage, tracking him I believe at the same time, getting us a bit more assistance, or just spotting him. Either way, he was out in the open. He's gone in essentially 2 shots. That's what the tank is really, really good at. However, at this point we now have a Tyrant that's YOLO'd on from below, and so we're going to aim at this guy, and there you go, he's gone as well. That's where that pack-a-punch of the 800 damage that you've got with the tank really comes in quite clutch. We've got 1,000 assist as well, so that's just from being relatively close to the opponents that we're at. You've got ourselves a gorilla here, and uh-oh, what was that? That is, of course, being absorbed by the track rather than penning the gorilla. There is absolutely no reason why we wouldn't pen the gorilla if we hit him in the side, unless we hit the track, and of course we hit the track. It does happen, especially if you're auto-aiming, which does mean that you can't just auto-aim and fire against a lot of these tanks. Yes, I know, I'm not taking my own advice. But the gorilla's over here, he's now trying to get a shot on us, and in this process we launch the booster, see if we can get around him. That may have saved our lives in a different life, if there wasn't a Turan there to finish us off. But of course the boost, you can suddenly surge forward and people can be left trailing behind with their turret traverse, and it can save you occasionally. It didn't there, and I'm not going to complain all too much because the gorilla should have been gone way before when he actually was, and we survived an aviary to the backside, so you know, we were alive a lot longer than I should have been, but we could have capitalized a bit more. That was a big misplay from me. We should have gone for the turret of the Gorilla 15. He would have been gone in the first shot rather than the second one. And then, of course, maybe we could have got another shot into the Turan and got ourselves over, you know, 3k damage in this game with a decent chunk of assistance. But either way, the team decide that they're just going to throw the game anyway, and we end up losing. But in terms of how the tank plays, you can see that the armor does work, but in terms of, like, is it going to work all of the time? My opinion of it, we played quite a few games in it to get a good feel for the vehicle, and overall, it kind of, it's okay. It's neither absolutely garbage, and it's definitely not overpowered or competitive. Really, in my opinion, there are far better vehicles that are more consistent to use, that are more of a threat offensively, but it's still decent. I think you can have some good games, and the more you master the differences between the AP and HE, then you're going to do much better. And of course, having the advanced reload, I think, as an equipment slot to be able to swap between the two rounds is going to be what I would recommend for the most part. So yeah, you just got to be very aware that the HE is definitely not like what it is on PC, where you can go through tracks. I'm so used to playing it over there, where we played like 250 plus battles, maybe 300 battles in the BZ, something like that. And I can tell you for sure, this tank is in a much better balance-wise state than the PC version. But does that mean that you should spend your money on it? I'm not so sure if you want a competitive tank. But equally, it's probably the cheapest it's ever going to be, and if you're willing to spend the like about £10 to pick up a premium tank at tier 8, I think it's a decent shout. It's not the best one that we've had as part of the Ultimate Season Pass, but it's not bad. So make of that what you will. Of course, if you're watching this in the future, I probably wouldn't spend 10,000 gold on, or anywhere near that, in terms of purchasing the tank. But there you go. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to like it. And of course, subscribe down below if you want to see some more World of Tanks console content. And I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.